Since the dawn of man, people have been looking at birds, bats and flies and thought to themselves, damn, wish they were me. Yep, the question of how to fly has been one of the most pondered questions in human history. And this is the story of the people that walked so we could run. Or more accurately, the people who fell to their demise so that we don't have to. You see, trying to fly is a process with a lot of trial and error. And in this case, the error is usually fatal. With most of the earlier attempts at flight, people have looked at nature and tried to emulate that. And what flies? Birds. How do birds fly? By doing this. So that's what people tried. From Bladud, king of the Britons in BC, to Andalusian scientist Abbas ibn Firnas, to the 11th century monk Elmer of Malmesbury who fell off a tower. Hell, even the word aviation literally translates to bird action. Some of these failed attempts might be blamed on the Greeks. You see, in one of their more famous myths, the legendary craftsman Daedalus makes two pairs of wings, one for himself and one for his son, Icarus. They were beautiful works of art, master-crafted metal feathers on a frame made from the finest leather in all of Greece, all held together using beeswax. And the wings, well, they worked. Daedalus and Icarus soared through the sky, but just like a drug addict, Icarus thought he wasn't high enough and started flying higher. And since the Greeks hadn't invented physics back then, the lapse rate, or the phenomenon that higher altitudes usually equal colder temperatures, doesn't apply here. So after a while, the heat of the sun melted the beeswax that held Icarus' wings together, causing him to clear out his schedule for an impromptu meeting with Hades. Now I know that in this myth the wings fail, but still, it's heavily implied that if Icarus just flew a bit lower, or if Daedalus had a bit more common sense when it came to building materials, the wings would have worked fine. In other words, strapping wings to your arms worked so well that there's a risk of dying from it working too well. So can attaching bird wings to your arms theoretically work? Short answer, no. Long answer, no it fucking won't. You see, birds have one thing that humans do not, and that is millions upon millions of years of evolution. Birds are optimized for flight. They have hollow bones which drastically reduce their weight. Their feathers not only keep them warm, but are also instrumental for the bird's aerodynamics, and the muscles in their wings are evolved in a way that makes flight actually doable for longer periods of time. On the other hand, you have humans. Thick, heavy bones, mostly bald, large all-purpose muscles basically everywhere. To actually fly, your wings would need to be, to use a scientific term, fucking huge. For an adult male, it's 7 meters, the size of a 2-story building. And that's if you're actually strong enough to flap them up and down, which, trust me, you're not. No, for flight to actually work, we have to get away from the idea that flapping wings is the only way to actually fly. And for that, we go to 6th century China, where man-carrying kites were used for reconnaissance and punishment. One of, if not the earliest record of manned flight, is that of Prince Yuan Hangtu of the Northern Wei dynasty, who was taken prisoner by the rival Qi dynasty. He was strapped to a so-called paper owl and yeeted off a tower. He was apparently the only prisoner to actually survive his flight, and had glided more than 2 kilometers before finally landing. Another thing the Chinese had figured out while Europe was still banging rocks together was the idea that hot air goes up, with small paper balloons called sky lanterns being launched during festivals and holidays. But how do you use it for murder? Very simple, said a general named Zhu Liang, who did the 200 AD equivalent of that one scene in Megamind where the blue guy uses a bunch of drones to intimidate Super Virgin. But still, these balloons weren't manned. For that, we need to skip a couple of centuries. Welcome to France in the late 18th century. Only a couple of years before the French nobility got a collective neck shortening. During this time, many innovations in the field of ballooning were made, and it quickly became all the rage in European high society. You see, what made ballooning different from strapping someone to a kite is that ballooning isn't fucking terrifying, and also much safer. As long as the balloon doesn't rupture or catch fire, you're good. Though these balloons weren't all that useful. You really only had control over going up and down. Everything else was up to the wind. That didn't mean that people didn't immediately weaponize them. During the American debate on whether or not slavery was bad, the Union Army had what could arguably be called the world's first Air Force, the US Balloon Corps. And in typical American fashion, they also technically built the first aircraft carrier. But what did these balloons do? Well, sadly, there wasn't any balloon-on-balloon dogfighting going on. These balloons were only used for reconnaissance. But they were still extremely effective. So effective that the Confederates were like, well, shit on a stick, leaders. We gotta get ourselves some of them newfangled balloon thingamajigs. And then proceeded to utterly fail. Their first balloon began spinning uncontrollably. The second balloon drifted away after one of the handlers got tangled in the tether wire, and their third balloon was made from ladies' underwear. You see, the Confederacy was under embargo and therefore couldn't get the silk needed to build balloons. So they simply went door to door and collected every silk piece of fabric they could find. And somehow that balloon was actually capable of flight. Not for long though, since the coal used to keep it in the air produced so much smoke that it was limited to only fly for a couple of hours at a time. In the meantime, the Union balloons could stay airborne basically indefinitely because they were filled with lighter than air gas instead of smoke. But still, the usefulness of these kinds of uncontrollable balloons was limited to being a slightly higher and easier to transport watchtower. If you want a first powered, controlled and sustained flight, then look no further than the dirigible balloon, or as you might know it, These turn-of-the-century behemoths were the first aircraft that actually went where you wanted them to go. And just like every innovation we've talked about thus far, it didn't take long before people figured out you could use them to kill your fellow man. In what is in my opinion one of the most terrifying acts of psychological warfare, the Germans used their airships to bomb London during the First World War. In terms of property damage, they weren't really effective. In terms of damage to the British psyche, well, just imagine yourself looking up and seeing the sky filled with 200-meter airships raining death from above as a feeling of dread and fear not felt since the Romans first encountered war elephants is creeping over you as nobody around you seems to know what to do. That is until the British found out that these airships were absolutely gigantic and also really fucking flammable. Hey, Pepe, you're already talking about the First World War and you haven't even mentioned the Wright brothers yet. What's up with that? First of all, fuck you, I was getting to that. And secondly, before we talk about that, we need to set some ground rules. There are two types of flight, lighter than air and heavier than air. With lighter than air flight, you fly because the aircraft is, as the name suggests, lighter than air. These are things like balloons and zeppelins. With heavier than air flight, the aircraft is, you guessed it, heavier than air. For what could be considered the first powered heavier than air flight, we're not going to look at the Wright brothers. No. This is much earlier than that. Welcome to the Ottoman Empire, where in 1633, mad scientist and engineer Lagari Hassan Celebi strapped himself to a rocket filled with approximately 70 kilograms of gunpowder and launched himself off a cliff in Istanbul. His last words before launching being, "Oh Sultan, my Sultan, be blessed, I'm going to talk to Jesus." That man was fully prepared to die, which makes the fact that he survived even funnier. The rocket fell into the water about 100 meters out at sea, and after swimming back he stated, "Oh my Sultan, Jesus sends his regards." Absolute giga chat. Staying with mad scientists, the first thing that kind of resembles a plane can be attributed to the 17th century Italian inventor Tito Livio Burattini, who presented this fixed wing, thing to the Polish king. It was said that while it couldn't lift Burattini himself, it was reportedly able to lift his cat, who was, and I quote, able to land with only minor injuries. But for actual, sustained, powered, heavier than air flight, you need something else. That most hated of high school subjects, and the answer to the question of, what if math was somehow even more terrible? I am of course talking about physics. Now, I'm not going to talk about history's favorite autistic virgin apple catcher, Isaac Newton. Rather, I'm going to talk about a guy that, unless you're exceptionally nerdy, none of you have probably heard about. This is Sir George Cayley, the father of the aeroplane. His research into the physics of flight during the latter years of the 18th century laid the foundation for basically everything aircraft related. This man wasn't just drawing pretty planes or building gliders. This motherfucker discovered the 4 aerodynamic forces of flight, those being weight, drag, lift and thrust. His wing designs are still in use today. Oh yeah, and on top of that, he's the guy that figured out why birds fly. Move over to Vinky, there's a new Homo universalis in town. That being said, he was still a mad scientist with questionable morals. For example, in 1848, he had built a prototype of a glider. Small problem, it wasn't strong enough to safely carry an old male. So in true British aristocratic fashion, he just strapped an orphan to it and yeeted it off a tower. But actual powered flight was still very difficult due to the fact that mid-19th century steam engines are really fucking heavy. That changed in 1874 when French Navy officer Félix du Temple in his monoplane became the first man to ever achieve liftoff from its own power. Unless of course you count the before mentioned Ottoman guy who strapped himself to a fucking rocket. Around the same time, you had another French guy called Jean-Marie Le Bris, who in his artificial albatros, yes, that's really the name, became the first man to reach an altitude higher than the one he started at. So why do the Wright brothers get all the credit for being the first people to fly? Well, the Wright brothers were the first to successfully build an aircraft that was not only self-powered, but also heavier than air and could achieve higher altitudes than its starting point. None of the before mentioned aircraft had those capabilities. Zeppelins were powered and could reach altitudes higher than their starting point, but were lighter than air. Du Temple's monoplane was powered and heavier than air, but couldn't actually climb to higher altitudes. And Le Bris' artificial albatros was able to climb to higher altitudes, but had to be pulled along by a horse, making it not self-powered. That being said, had the Wright brothers waited a year, or even a couple of months, they wouldn't be as famous as they are today. There were a lot of people all over the world finagling with exactly the same thing they were. Most famous is probably Samuel Langley, who was given a boatload of cash by the US government to develop a man-carrying machine for aerial reconnaissance to be used in the Spanish-American War. Langley failed. Miserably. In fact, his plane failed so miserably that the next day the editorial of the New York Times claimed that it might be assumed that the flying machine, which will really fly, might be evolved by the combined and continuous efforts of mathematicians and mechanicians in from 1 to 10 million years. That article came out on October 9th, 1903. 2 months later, the Wright brothers would prove them wrong. "260 meters in 59 seconds. That's what cemented Orville and Wilbur Wright, together with their plane, the Wright Flyer, in the history books. And being the first meant that these brothers were loaded, quickly becoming the richest and only aircraft manufacturer in the country. Who was buying these planes? None other than Uncle Sam himself. I mean, by now you should have seen it coming that most innovations were done to make killing people more efficient. Anyway, around the early 1910s, their largest and only customer, the US Army, stopped ordering them because it was concerned about the plane's rising death toll, which was 11. That's especially impressive considering the fact that the Army only had 6 planes. But after that, after the Wright brothers had let the proverbial genie out of the bottle, aircraft innovation went fast. While the Wright brothers' plane only flew 260 meters and had terrible controls, the aircraft of the First World War were highly maneuverable and started the era of the dogfight. 2 decades later, you have the first jet aircraft. Skip another 2 decades and you have airliners able to get you anywhere on our flat earth within 24 hours. And now we live in a time where it's often cheaper to fly than to take public transport. The thing thousands throughout history have worked tirelessly to achieve. The pinnacle of our modern world. Mastery, not over land and sea, but over the skies themselves. Reduced to something mundane, something boring. So next time you're flying, think about all the people that made it possible. Or better yet, don't fly at all. It's really fucking bad for the environment. Like, global warming is not a joke. Like, I'm not joking here. Would it kill you to take a train for once?